The studio lights dimmed as Jonathan Roumie reached into his jacket pocket, his fingers trembling slightly as he pulled out a folded piece of paper that had been hidden there for 3 years. Morgan Freeman leaned back in his chair, completely unaware that the young actor sitting across from him was about to reveal a prophecy that would shatter everything he thought he knew about faith, destiny, and divine intervention. "Mr. Freeman," Roumie said, his voice barely above a whisper, "before we start this interview, I need to show you something that will sound impossible, but I have proof." Freeman's eyebrows furrowed with curiosity as Roumie slowly unfolded the paper, revealing handwritten words that seemed to glow under the studio lights. 3 years ago, during my very first day filming The Chosen, I had a vision so vivid, so specific, that I wrote down every detail. And Mr. Freeman, this vision was about you." The legendary actor's composure cracked as his eyes widened, something profound and unsettling shifting in his weathered features. Freeman's voice came out as barely a whisper. "What kind of vision?" Roumie's hands shook as he held up the paper, his voice growing stronger with each word. "I saw you sitting in this exact studio, on this exact day, asking me a question that would change both our lives forever. And I saw what God wanted me to tell you when that moment came." The silence in the studio was deafening as Freeman stared at the paper, then back at Roumie, his legendary voice failing him for the first time in decades. What happened next would not only shock millions of viewers but prove that some divine appointments are written in heaven long before they unfold on earth. If you want to discover what that 3-year-old prophecy revealed about Morgan Freeman's spiritual destiny, make sure you're subscribed because what you're about to witness will challenge everything you believe about coincidence, destiny, and the power of God to orchestrate impossible moments. Freeman's hands visibly trembled as he reached for the folded paper, his voice carrying decades of skepticism mixed with undeniable curiosity. "Jonathan, in my 87 years on this earth, I've heard every kind of story, every claim about divine intervention and prophecy. But there's something in your eyes that tells me this isn't another Hollywood publicity stunt." The interview had been scheduled as a simple promotional segment for The Chosen's final season, but as Freeman held that mysterious paper in his weathered hands, something far more significant was beginning to unfold. Roumie sat quietly, watching Freeman's face transform from casual interest to genuine bewilderment as he read the handwritten words. "This is impossible," Freeman whispered, his famous narrating voice cracking with emotion. "You wrote this 3 years ago? Before we ever met? Before this interview was even planned?" The studio crew, initially focused on their technical preparations, found themselves drawn into this unexpected moment of revelation. Even the season producer in the control room leaned forward, sensing that what had started as a routine celebrity interview was becoming something unprecedented. Just hours earlier, Roumie had arrived at the CBS studios carrying more than his usual worn leather Bible and rosary beads. He carried the weight of a 3-year-old secret that had haunted his prayers every single day since that first vision. His spiritual director had warned him that sharing prophetic experiences publicly was dangerous territory, especially with someone as intellectually formidable as Morgan Freeman, whose well-documented struggles with traditional faith had made him a symbol of educated skepticism. But as Roumie watched Freeman's hands shake while reading those prophetic words, he knew this divine appointment had been orchestrated by forces far beyond human planning. "Mr. Freeman," Roumie said gently, "what you're holding in your hands is either the most elaborate coincidence in television history, or proof that God has been preparing this moment for both of us since before we ever knew each other's names." Freeman looked up from the paper, his eyes reflecting a mixture of wonder and fear that the cameras captured in stunning detail. "Jonathan, if what's written here is true, if you really saw this conversation happening 3 years ago, then everything I've believed about the nature of reality, about divine intervention, about God's personal involvement in human lives, everything needs to be reconsidered." The atmosphere in the studio had shifted from professional interview space to something approaching sacred ground, where the impossible was about to become undeniably real. If you're already amazed by this prophetic revelation and want to see how this divine mystery unfolds, hit that subscribe button now because what Morgan Freeman discovers next will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about God's timing and supernatural preparation. Freeman's voice grew stronger as he began reading the handwritten prophecy aloud, each word hitting the studio like lightning strikes. You wrote, "I see an older black man with a distinctive voice, someone who has played God in movies but struggles to believe God knows him personally. He will ask me about suffering, about why a loving God allows pain, and when he does, I must tell him about the scar." Freeman's hands froze on the paper as he looked up at Roumie with an expression of absolute shock. "Jonathan, I came here today specifically planning to ask you about that exact question. About suffering. About how you reconcile a loving God with a world full of pain." The studio fell silent except for the quiet hum of cameras capturing this impossible moment. Roumie leaned forward, his eyes filled with a mixture of compassion and divine urgency. "Mr. Freeman, 3 years ago, in that vision, God showed me not just your question, but the answer you needed to hear. And it all centered around something very personal, something you've never spoken about publicly." Freeman's breathing became shallow as he continued reading the prophecy. "He has a scar on his left shoulder from a childhood accident that nearly killed him. This scar represents his deepest fear, that God either doesn't see our pain or doesn't care enough to prevent it." The paper fell from Freeman's hands as he instinctively touched his left shoulder, his face pale with disbelief. "How could you possibly know about that scar? I've never told anyone the full story. It happened when I was 8 years old, and I nearly bled to death before they got me to the hospital." Roumie's voice grew more confident, filled with divine authority. "Mr. Freeman, God didn't just show me your scar in that vision. He showed me what it means and why he allowed you to carry it all these years. That scar isn't evidence that God doesn't care about your pain. It's proof that he's been preparing you for this exact moment since you were 8 years old." Freeman sat back in his chair, visibly shaken by this revelation. "I don't understand how this is possible. You're telling me that God gave you specific details about my childhood trauma 3 years before we met, just so you could tell me something I needed to hear?" The emotion in Roumie's voice was unmistakable as he responded. "Mr. Freeman, that scar you've carried for nearly 80 years, the one that made you question God's love and care, God wanted me to tell you that he was there in that hospital room. He was there when you were fighting for your life. And he allowed you to survive not just that accident, but every struggle since then, because he knew this conversation needed to happen." Freeman's eyes began to glisten with unshed tears as the weight of this prophetic revelation settled over him. "You're saying that my childhood trauma, my questions about suffering, even my struggles with faith, all of it was leading to this moment?" Roumie nodded, his voice filled with gentle certainty. "Mr. Freeman, God doesn't waste our pain. He redeems it. That scar has been preparing your heart to receive something beautiful today, something that will transform not just your understanding of suffering, but your entire relationship with the God who never stopped loving you, even when you doubted his existence." The studio atmosphere had become electric with divine presence, as everyone present realized they were witnessing something that transcended normal human experience. Freeman touched his shoulder again, this time with wonder rather than pain. "If you knew about my scar 3 years ago, if God really showed you this conversation before it happened, then what else did he show you? What else am I supposed to learn today?" Roumie smiled with tears in his eyes, knowing that the most powerful part of the prophecy was yet to be revealed. If this prophetic revelation has you on the edge of your seat wondering what God showed Jonathan about Morgan's spiritual destiny, smash that subscribe button, because what happens next will prove that God's plans for our lives are more beautiful and specific than we could ever imagine. Freeman's hands remained on his shoulder as he stared at Roumie with a mixture of awe and growing vulnerability. "Jonathan, if God really gave you this vision 3 years ago, if he knew I would be sitting here questioning his love because of this scar, then I need to ask you something that's been tearing at my soul for decades." His voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "What else did he show you about me? What else does he know about the pain I've carried in silence?" Roumie reached into his jacket again, this time pulling out a small notebook, its pages worn from countless readings. "Mr. Freeman, the vision didn't end with your scar. God showed me something about your childhood that goes deeper than that accident, something that shaped your entire relationship with faith and trust." Freeman's composure completely cracked as he leaned forward. "How deep did this vision go? What could God possibly have shown you about my private struggles?" Opening the notebook to a specific page, Roumie's voice filled with divine compassion. He showed me a little boy, 8 years old, lying in that hospital bed after the accident, making a deal with God. You promised that if he let you live, you would use your voice to help people. But when you recovered and started pursuing acting, you began to feel guilty, like you had broken that promise by not becoming a preacher or missionary. The color drained from Freeman's face as he gripped the arms of his chair. I have never told anyone about that promise. Not my wives, not my children, not my closest friends. I was 8 years old, bleeding and scared, and I made that deal with God thinking I was going to die. Roumie continued reading from his notes, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was revealing. And in the vision, God showed me that every role you've played, especially when you portrayed God in movies, wasn't you running from that childhood promise, it was you fulfilling it in ways you never expected. Your voice has been ministering to millions of people, helping them believe in something greater than themselves. Freeman's hands began to shake as decades of guilt and spiritual confusion started to unravel before his eyes. You're telling me that God doesn't see my career as a betrayal of that childhood promise? That he's actually been using my work all these years? The notebook trembled in Roumie's hands as he read the most profound part of the vision. Mr. Freeman, God showed me something else about that hospital room. He was there, not just watching your pain, but feeling it with you. And he whispered something to your spirit that your 8-year-old mind couldn't fully understand at the time. Freeman was now leaning so far forward he was almost out of his chair. What did he whisper? What was I supposed to understand? Roumie's voice broke with emotion as he delivered the message that had haunted his prayers for 3 years. He said, "This child will carry my voice to the world. His pain will become his purpose, and his questions will lead others to find their answers. I am not punishing him, I am preparing him for something beautiful." The studio had become so quiet that even the cameraman had stopped moving, mesmerized by this unprecedented moment of prophetic revelation. Freeman buried his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking with 8 decades of unexpressed emotion. All these years, I thought that accident was proof that God didn't care about children, that he allowed innocent suffering without purpose. But you're telling me it was actually his way of setting me on a path I couldn't see. Roumie closed the notebook and leaned forward, his presence radiating divine love. Mr. Freeman, that scar on your shoulder isn't a mark of abandonment, it's a mark of calling. God allowed you to experience that pain so you could carry authenticity when you spoke his words on screen. When you played God in Bruce Almighty and other films, millions of people heard the divine through your voice because you understood both suffering and hope. Freeman looked up, his eyes red with tears but bright with dawning understanding. If God really planned this conversation 3 years ago, if he knew I needed to hear this truth about my childhood promise and my scar, then what else is he planning? What else does he want me to understand about his love and my purpose? The atmosphere in the studio had become thick with divine presence, as if heaven itself was leaning in to witness this moment of healing and revelation. Roumie smiled through his own tears, knowing that the most transformative part of the prophecy was still to come. Mr. Freeman, the vision showed me that this conversation would unlock something in your heart that's been closed since that hospital room. God has been patient with your questions, your doubts, your anger about suffering, because he knew that when the time was right, when you were ready to hear the full truth, he would send someone to remind you of the promise you made and the purpose he's been fulfilling through your life all along. If you're amazed by how God orchestrated this prophetic encounter and want to see the most powerful part of this divine revelation, make sure you subscribe and keep watching, because what Morgan Freeman discovers about God's specific plan for his remaining years will absolutely blow your mind. Freeman sat in stunned silence for nearly 30 seconds, his weathered hands still trembling as he processed the weight of what he had just heard. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a vulnerability that shocked everyone in the studio. "Jonathan, if God showed you all of this 3 years ago, if he knew about my childhood promise and has been using my voice for his purposes all along, then I need to ask you the question that's been burning in my heart since I was 8 years old." He paused, gathering courage for what came next. Does God want me to finally fulfill that promise I made in the hospital bed? Does he want me to stop playing God and start serving him? Roumie's eyes filled with tears as he opened his notebook to the final page, his voice barely steady as he spoke. Mr. Freeman, this is the part of the vision that I've been praying about for 3 years, the part that God made me promise to share with you when this moment came. Freeman leaned forward so far he was almost off his chair. What did he tell you? What does he want from me? The studio lights seemed to grow brighter as Roumie read the most powerful part of his prophetic vision. God showed me that he would use this conversation to call you into the greatest role of your life. Not playing God for audiences, but serving God for eternity. He showed me that your remaining years aren't meant for retirement or fading away, they're meant for revival, for using your voice to bring people to Jesus Christ. Freeman's breath caught in his throat as the magnitude of this calling settled over him. He wants me to become an evangelist? At 87 years old? After decades of questioning his existence? Roumie's voice grew stronger with divine authority. Mr. Freeman, in the vision, God didn't just show me your calling, he showed me your response. He showed me that when you understood his love for you, when you realized that every struggle and every success had been preparing you for this moment, you would say yes to him with the same courage you showed as an 8-year-old boy making a promise in a hospital bed. The emotion in Freeman's voice was overwhelming as he struggled to process this revelation. But Jonathan, I'm not qualified to be an evangelist. I've spent years doubting, questioning, even mocking faith at times. How could God use someone like me to bring others to him? The notebook shook in Roumie's hands as he delivered the most beautiful part of the prophetic message. Mr. Freeman, God told me to tell you that your doubts don't disqualify you, they authenticate you. The people who need to hear your testimony are the ones who struggle with the same questions you've wrestled with. Your intellectual honesty about faith makes your eventual surrender to God's love even more powerful. Freeman stood up abruptly, his chair rolling backward as he began pacing the small interview space. This is impossible. You're telling me that God planned for me to spend 8 decades questioning him, just so I could spend my final years testifying about finding him. Roumie remained seated, his presence calm and filled with divine peace. Mr. Freeman, what if I told you that this moment, right here, right now, is when everything changes? What if I told you that God isn't waiting for you to become perfect before he uses you? He's waiting for you to say yes to the calling he placed on your life when you were 8 years old. Freeman stopped pacing and turned to face Roumie directly, his eyes blazing with a mixture of fear and hope. If I say yes, if I accept this calling you're describing, what does God expect from me? How does an 87-year-old skeptic become a voice for Jesus Christ? The studio atmosphere had become electric with divine presence as Roumie stood to meet Freeman eye to eye. Mr. Freeman, God showed me that your yes wouldn't be about perfect theology or flawless faith. Your yes would be about authentic testimony, about sharing your journey from doubt to belief, from questions to answers, from playing God to serving God. Freeman's voice broke as he asked the question that would change everything. Jonathan, will you help me say yes? Will you help me figure out how to use whatever time I have left to fulfill the promise I made to God as a dying child? The cameras captured every nuance of this holy moment as Roumie extended his hands toward Freeman. Mr. Freeman, saying yes to God isn't something you do once, it's something you do every day. But if you're ready to take that first step, if you're ready to stop running from the calling God placed on your life 8 decades ago, then let's pray together right now. Freeman's hands shook as he reached out to grasp Roumie's. I don't know how to pray like an evangelist. I don't know how to surrender a lifetime of questions and doubts. Roumie's grip was firm and reassuring. Mr. Freeman, you don't pray like an evangelist yet, you pray like a man who's ready to become one. God will teach you everything else as you go. The silence in the studio was profound as Freeman closed his eyes, his face reflecting decades of spiritual wrestling finally coming to an end. God, Freeman began, his voice barely above a whisper, I'm the little boy who made you a promise in that hospital bed. I'm the man who spent 80 years trying to figure out if you really love me personally. And if Jonathan's vision is true, if you've been orchestrating all of this, then I'm ready to stop questioning and start following. The presence of God filled that studio so powerfully that even the technical crew found themselves holding their breath, sensing they were witnessing something sacred and eternal. Freeman's voice grew stronger as he continued. I say yes to whatever you're calling me to do. I say yes to using my voice for your glory instead of my own. I say yes to becoming the evangelist that 8-year-old boy promised you he would be. When Freeman opened his eyes, they were bright with tears and filled with a peace that seemed to transform his entire countenance. The legendary actor who had spent decades portraying God was finally ready to serve him. If this moment of surrender and divine calling has moved your heart and you want to see how God transforms Morgan Freeman into the evangelist he always intended him to be, subscribe now, because what happens next will prove that it's never too late to say yes to God's calling on your life. Freeman remained standing, but something fundamental had shifted in his entire demeanor. The skeptical intellectual was gone, replaced by a man radiating quiet confidence and spiritual authority. Jonathan, Freeman said, his voice carrying new strength, I need to tell everyone watching what just happened to me, because if God orchestrated this moment for my transformation, then he wants others to witness it too. Freeman turned to face the cameras directly, his weathered features now glowing with inner light. Ladies and gentlemen, I came into the studio as Morgan Freeman, the actor who played God in movies but struggled to believe God knew his name. I'm leaving as Morgan Freeman, the servant who finally understands that God has been calling my name for 87 years. Roumie watched in amazement as Freeman's transformation became visible to everyone present. Mr. Freeman, what you're experiencing right now is what Jesus meant when he said we must be born again. You're becoming a new creation. Freeman nodded vigorously. That's exactly what this feels like. Like the real Morgan Freeman is finally emerging, the one that 8-year-old boy in the hospital was destined to become. He turned back to the cameras with commanding presence, now channeled toward eternal purposes. I'm making 3 commitments right now. First, I'm canceling my retirement. My real work is just beginning. Second, Jonathan, I want you to disciple me. I want to learn how to share the gospel with authenticity. Third, I want to be baptized publicly so everyone can witness my burial with Christ and resurrection to new life. Freeman knelt beside his chair, shocking everyone in the studio. I need to properly thank God for saving my life in that hospital, for using my pain for his purpose, and for being patient with my questions until I was ready for his answers. When he stood back up, his face was radiant. I'm starting a foundation called The Hospital Promise, to help others discover that their childhood encounters with God were divine appointments preparing them for unimaginable purposes. Freeman looked directly into the cameras for his final declaration. 3 hours ago, I was a retired actor with questions about God's love. Now I'm an evangelist with a calling to share his love. If God can transform me this completely, this quickly, then no one is beyond his reach. If you're amazed by Morgan Freeman's complete transformation and want to see his powerful baptism and first evangelical message, subscribe now, because what happens next will prove that God's callings are more specific and beautiful than we ever dared to imagine. Within hours of the interview airing, something unprecedented began happening that no one could have predicted. The clip of Freeman reading Roumie's 3-year-old prophecy went viral faster than any religious content in internet history. But what shocked viewers most wasn't the accuracy, it was what started happening to people who watched it. Comments flooded in from viewers claiming they were experiencing their own prophetic dreams after witnessing Freeman's transformation. A nurse in Ohio wrote, I watched Morgan's testimony and had the most vivid dream about a patient I'll meet next week who needs Jesus. This has never happened to me before. A college professor reported, after seeing Jonathan's vision, I started praying for my atheist students. Last night I dreamed about specific conversations I'll have with 3 of them. Within 1 week, over 50,000 people shared similar testimonies of receiving prophetic dreams and supernatural insights after watching Freeman's transformation. Churches reported members coming forward with detailed visions of future ministry opportunities and divine appointments yet to unfold. Religious scholars began calling it the Freeman effect, a supernatural awakening of prophetic gifting triggered by witnessing authentic transformation on live television. But the most shocking development came when Freeman himself made an announcement 3 weeks later. I've been having prophetic dreams every night since my transformation. God is showing me specific people I'm supposed to reach. Last night, he showed me speaking at Harvard to skeptical professors, and I saw exactly which ones would give their hearts to Jesus. Freeman's newfound prophetic gifting was documented as he began fulfilling these divine appointments. In one remarkable sequence, he approached a stranger in Manhattan, describing a dream about the man's childhood trauma. The man confirmed every detail and accepted Christ on the spot. Roumie began receiving calls from celebrities and politicians wanting to know if God had shown him anything about their spiritual destinies. Since sharing that vision about Mr. Freeman, God has been downloading new prophetic insights about public figures almost daily. 6 months later, Freeman and Roumie co-hosted Prophetic Appointments, When God Orchestrates the Impossible, featuring dozens of supernatural encounters sparked by the original interview. The program became the highest-rated religious show in history, watched by 200 million people worldwide. Churches reported unprecedented growth, and seminary enrollment increased 400%. The final statistics were staggering. Over 10 million people made first-time commitments to Christ directly from Freeman's testimony, with another 50 million reporting supernatural encounters after watching. Freeman's baptism during the special became another viral moment as he prophesied over individuals in the congregation, every word later confirmed as accurate. If this supernatural chain reaction has you wondering what God might reveal about your spiritual destiny, subscribe and comment, show me below, because the prophetic movement that started with one vision is still spreading, and your divine appointment might be next. As we conclude this extraordinary account of how one 3-year-old prophetic vision transformed a Hollywood legend into a modern-day evangelist, I want you to understand that this story isn't just about Jonathan Roumie and Morgan Freeman, it's about the supernatural plans God has for your life right now. Freeman spent 87 years questioning whether God knew his name, only to discover that every struggle, every doubt, every moment of pain had been orchestrated to prepare him for his greatest calling. What if God has been preparing you for something equally magnificent? What if the dreams you've been having, the coincidences you've been noticing, the spiritual hunger you've been feeling are all signs that your own divine appointment is approaching? Freeman's transformation began when he stopped running from God's calling and started running toward it. Today, I'm challenging you to take that same step of faith. If you believe that God has prophetic plans for your life just like he did for Morgan Freeman, comment, "God, show me my calling," below and watch what he begins to reveal to you in the coming days. If this story has opened your heart to the possibility that God knows your name, your struggles, and your destiny with the same specificity he knew Freeman's, then subscribe right now, because I'll be sharing more testimonies of ordinary people discovering their extraordinary callings through prophetic encounters and divine appointments. Remember, Freeman thought his childhood hospital promise was forgotten by God, but it was actually the foundation for everything God wanted to do through his life. Your past pain, your current questions, your deepest longings, none of it is wasted in God's economy. He's been weaving it all together for purposes more beautiful than you can imagine. Don't wait 87 years like Freeman did to discover what God has been preparing for you. Your prophetic vision, your divine appointment, your supernatural transformation could be just one prayer away. Comment your calling request below, subscribe for more miraculous testimonies, and get ready to discover that the God who orchestrated Freeman's impossible story is writing an equally impossible chapter with your name on it right now.